This is Compendium, a podcast about communication and communication research. This podcast is brought to you in conjunction with the COM 1000 course at the University of Connecticut. Here now is the host of Compendium, Professor Steve Stifano.
Hello again, everybody, and welcome to episode number 5 of Compendium. I'm your host, Professor Steve Stifano, and today we have a very intriguing conversation for you. We are going to talk to an expert in sex communication, someone who has done a lot of research on a couple interesting topics, first being pickup artists, and the second being pillow talk. Be advised that this conversation will deal with some sensitive topics related to sex, but it is incredibly fascinating. So Dr. Amanda Dennis is our guest today, and since our conversation went on for a while, without any further ado, let's hear from Dr. Dennis. All right, so my guest today is an interpersonal communication researcher who's done a lot of fascinating work on a couple of topics that most of us find interesting, but might have been afraid to research if we had been in her position. Welcome to the show, Dr. Amanda Dennis.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
All right, well, we're going to start with the questions that we ask everybody, and that's about how you got to this chair right here today. So first things first, where were you born?
I was born in Glen Ridge, New Jersey. Okay. I'm born and raised in New Jersey. I love New Jersey, despite the way it's portrayed in the media. I'm still a proud Jersey girl.
Okay, and my experience has been that most Jersey girls are in fact proud, and that there are some misrepresentations. And as a Rhode Island guy myself, we are familiar with some of those misrepresentations.
Definitely. I always tell people that what they see on TV and on the Jersey Shore is not inaccurate. It's just not all of New Jersey. So there are definitely those folks out there. Not everybody's one of them.
I think that's a fair way to put it. Mm-hmm. So you were born, you go into school. What was the first moment you had that might have signaled to us in school that you would end up in a communication program?
I really was interested in journalism when I was younger, especially in high school as part of the school newspaper. And I had always sort of imagined myself being a journalist, whether that be writing or on the news. And so originally when I thought about doing communication work, I had focused much more on the media side of things, which, as you know, I'm no longer on that side. So things shifted a bit along the way.
Yeah, well, that tends to happen to a lot of people. I was big into media and journalism, but then as a person was Mr. Interpersonal, talking about relationships and life. And then I ended up swinging all the way back around and doing the film and media stuff and all that. So I do think that we tend to go back and forth sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's pretty normal to learn new things along the way, especially with interpersonal. It's not something you ever even realize is an area of study when you're in high school.
Right.
And so I think learning about that in college made me aware that this is actually something I can study. I can talk about relationships for the rest of my life. That sounded great.
Right. And it is, because it's a fun topic. And you've mentioned it before in your work that, people are drawn to that topic and they immediately gravitate to it. So what motivated you to know that you wanted to study communication further? So journalism, a background, then you drift into the interpersonal. But what was that moment where you said, I really want to go for this?
Yeah, it was when I took my first interpersonal communication class in undergrad. I had been doing internships in journalism and media, and I just wasn't excited about them anymore. And so I went back, I think it was my junior year, and I took interpersonal communication with Pamela Nudi, my undergrad advisor. Mm-hmm. And I just loved the class, and I loved Pam. I wanted to be Pam. So I tried my hardest in that class, and then at the end of the semester, I went up to her and I said, I want to be you. How do I do this? She's like, well, you have to get a PhD, and she pretty much mentored me through the rest of the process. And so it was after that class that I really knew that this was what I wanted to do.
It's really interesting to think that you had a moment at such an early age where you said, this is what I want to be. I want to be you, mm-hmm. and help. And then you went all the way through and have done so with flying colors.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, Pam was a great mentor and really taught me the ropes and introduced me to research. And so very grateful to have had her mentor me along the way. And now she's a friend and colleague. And so I think it's weird for her to, see that this person who was her undergrad is now a professor somewhere as well. And actually, my undergrad professor is now a faculty member in this department as well. Ken Laughlin was my first communication professor in undergrad. So it's really fun for me to kind of see it come full circle as well.
Talk about a full circle.
Yeah.
To see that first professor show up here as your new colleague.
Right.
Dr. Laughlin just joined us. So that is really interesting. When you were coming through school, first of all, where did you go to college? I forgot to ask that question.
I went to Boston College.
So you were up here. You were a Northeast person.
Yes.
And then you didn't stay on the East Coast.
I didn't stay. I had 5 lovely years in Santa Barbara, California. So straight from Boston College, I went into a combined MA PhD program at UCSB. And yeah, that was a great experience since I knew that I wanted to be a professor. Going into that combined format was really helpful. I didn't have to reapply. And I got to live by the beach for 5 years and do my studying there. And so, especially in this weather, I miss it a lot. It was a wonderful place to learn to be a scholar.
Just the idea of California when it's 22 degrees and snowing outside every third day.
Oh, definitely. I used to call my parents when I was on the beach in the middle of winter and ask them how the snow was, and now I'm back in the snow, so they're laughing at me.
Yeah, you've been landlocked into the Northeast now here at UConn in cold and windy stores. All right, so the last question about your schooling, was there any moment that reinforced the professor career or maybe even challenged it? Was it a smooth sailing all the way through? Was it a linear thing where you were set on it, or?
It was pretty smooth sailing. I have loved research since I started doing it in undergrad. And so I think my experiences in graduate school really just reinforced that for me. And I love teaching as well. And so being in the classroom for the first time during graduate school made me sure that this was a good mix of being able to do the teaching and the research. But I think really working in the lab with my graduate school advisor, Tammy Afifi, that reinforced my interest in doing work with couples, bringing people into the lab. I'm sure we'll talk about it more, but looking at people's physiology and biology. And so working on her projects really helped shape my now current research interests.
It's just interesting that you point that out. I mean, obviously in COM 1000, we introduce students to the research requirement. We have them participate in studies, but they don't always get a full picture unless they're involved in a lot of lab studies of exactly what's going on. And even then, they shouldn't get a complete picture of what's going on. But there really is something to be said for research. And I think it's one of those things that you don't get until you try it. So I'm glad that you mentioned that first sort of exposure is important.
It is. And I know we have the COM 4992, which a lot of students do, and it gets them more hands-on experience depending on what they're doing. But that's a great way, too, just to see this other side of things. You know, people are exposed to research all the time, but they don't realize how it's done. So I think learning the whole process and seeing it and being part of it is really exciting for students.
And, you know, related to that, I think that, you know, as a student, you participate in research, and as a student, you listen to lectures and you take notes and you take exams and do assignments. There is a moment in every academic's career where we transition from being on that side to this side. And it's usually a very sudden moment. Like, all right, you're the teacher, get up there. Or, you know, it's your research project, go. Or you're in the lab, you're running this, go. And I think that, I don't know that students are always familiar with that.
Yeah, and I think it can be really exciting to see the other side. People either, I think, love it or hate it. They're like, oh, wow, this is weird and confusing. Or they're like, whoa, this is so cool. I get to ask the questions, and I get to discover this new data and these new exciting findings. And I think for, you know, people like me who end up in this profession, we had that moment where like, this is exciting to be on the other side, to transition over.
Right. No, I absolutely agree. Okay, so now I'd like to start to talk about your research. So the easiest way to say this, essentially, is that you research the communication of sex.
Yeah, that would be a fair way to put it. I've been trying to own the title sex researcher. I know that can be kind of a taboo thing to call yourself, but I used to go to a lot of sexuality conferences, and there was a lot of support for, you know, labeling yourself not just as a comm researcher, whatever discipline you come from, but also as a sex researcher, so that people get more comfortable with that idea and about talking about sex.
And this is a topic that we don't get into very much at all in COM 1000. A lot of times we don't even get into it in other theory courses. But it's obviously there. There's taboos associated with it. You've talked a lot about that. We'll get there. We'll talk about the taboos and the work there. But I'd like to start by talking about, or at least inquiring about, and I'm really curious about this, your research on pickup artists.
Oh, my pickup artist research. Yeah. Okay. So the pickup artist research, it actually started when I took a class in graduate school about gender and language. It was in the linguistics department. And as part of that course, we had to in some way look at how language was being used in gendered ways. And I had been interested for a while in the hormone oxytocin, which is related to my other research on pillow talk. And I was doing some research on oxytocin, and I found this website where there were a bunch of pickup artists talking about how to manipulate women's biology and get their oxytocin levels up so that they'll trust you more, so that you could seduce them and basically get them into bed. And so obviously I found this really troubling and problematic. And so I started to read the pickup artist literature, and I decided to do an analysis of the book The Mystery Method, How to Get Beautiful Women into Bed by none other than Mystery, the pickup artist. And it's just a really problematic book that looks at ways for men to seduce women. And what I was arguing in the paper that I wrote about pickup artists is that they start off with some okay practices. They focus on communication and getting to know someone, things that I think any interpersonal researcher would say is a good thing.
Right.
But then as the book goes on, it gets blurrier, and issues of consent really came up for me. It seemed like the pickup artists were promoting pushing a woman to engage in sexual activity even after she has said no. So there's a lot about dropping the communication. There's these lines where the pickup artist, will tell his readers, if she says that she shouldn't do anything more with you, just agree with her and keep going. And it was things like this that I found really problematic and bordering on what in the literature they call rape scripts, and contributing to these rape culture ideas. And so I started to critique that. And that was an article that I guess came out in 2012 where I was picking apart pickup artists, which they ended up not liking. So there's some pickup artist blogs that talk about that article and me in really negative ways. I don't think they like being critiqued.
On behalf of the field, though, I think I say thank you.
Yeah, it felt important to point these things out. So.
It does seem like the kind of thing that deserves some attention, and not necessarily in the positive way.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think someone had to say it, and a lot of people have thought these things before. They've been discussed on feminist blogs and feminist websites, but to actually have an academic article critiquing it, I think is just useful for people doing future research on pickup artists.
So I'm just thinking, could you potentially, as the critic, and we always say, well, if you're the critic, then what's your suggestion? Could you draw a line between pickup artists, tree, if you will, and seduction? Are there two different things?
Yeah, I mean, they would call themselves, masters of the art of seduction. And I think that, at least from my understanding of what seduction is more communication-based. It's about talk and about getting to know somebody. And I think that there is a line between... I think the early parts of some of these pickup artist manuals do focus on seduction. It's just really when it gets to the actual part of trying to get a woman into the bedroom and to engage in sexual activity that it becomes problematic. So I think if they just stayed away from focusing on the sexual aspect and focused more on things that people can do to build relationships, which is seduction, which is communication, I don't think that's necessarily problematic. It's only when you start to be encouraging a woman to do things she has already said she doesn't want to do sexually that then you move away, I think, from seduction and start to get into the problematic area.
And I think one of the things that makes this whole area of research, inquiry, conversation so tough is that, and we talk about this a lot, and, unfortunately there was a whole pop culture song about it, but there are a lot of blurred lines, and it's very quick to progress from something that's okay or a normal part of human mating rituals or relationships or development into something that's completely and totally inappropriate, violating, troublesome, a crime. So it's really hard to kind of draw those cutoffs at times.
Yeah, definitely. And I think if anyone else has read the book, The Mystery Method, it becomes pretty clear that there is this shift in the book where things that seemed practical, like practical advice, shift to problematic advice. I think it's obvious to the reader. The thing that was really hard for me as I was reading the book is that the book is aimed towards, like nerdy guys. That's how Mystery sets it up. People who are sometimes scared and nervous to talk to women. And here he's giving these people advice that says you just need to keep pushing a woman and to cross that blurred line and to not listen to her when she says no. And so, training people to engage in these practices that, we see on campuses, we're trying to stop those things. We're trying to emphasize consent and respect for women, and to have a book out there that is basically saying the opposite and training men to do the opposite is just a little bit scary.
Maybe even more than a little bit. Okay, so now let's get off the kind of creepy pickup artist line and maybe talk about something a little bit more germane to everybody, and that's this concept of pillow talk. And you've done a lot of research on pillow talk. You smile when I say it. I think you should absolutely take a minute and describe to us your work and what you do with it.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be associated with pillow talk. I think it's an important thing in relationships, and is an understudied area. So there's plenty of research that focuses on the build-up to sexual activity and how things like foreplay can influence people's sexual experiences. But people tend to stop after that. So they talk about foreplay, they talk about the sexual episode and how those two things influence relationships. But then it's like once the sex is done, it's over. But what we know now and what in the past 10 years scholars have really started to look at is what happens after. So after the sexual activity is complete, there's those moments afterwards that couples engage in that can be really intimate times. And so I was intrigued by the idea that how people communicate with one another after sexual activity might really be influencing the relationship. It could hurt or help the relationship. And so I started off by looking at what were the things that predicted how people communicated during this time. And so my very first study, which was based on the idea that when people experience sexual climax or orgasm, that there's certain hormones that are released that might make them feel safer and more trusting, and that hormone's oxytocin. And oxytocin is known as the love hormone or the trust hormone. And we know from other research from the hard sciences that when people experience orgasm, they get this surge of oxytocin. And so what I argued in my first study is that when people get that surge of oxytocin, they might feel like this is a really safe time for telling my partner that I care about them, for sharing experiences, for saying that I love you to my partner. And so in that first study, I compared people who did versus did not orgasm, and I did find that that predicted how people communicated during pillow talk. So it's the first kind of look into pillow talk from a communication perspective.
It's simple biologically, but it's not simple at all from a communicative perspective.
Definitely. I mean, there's a lot of things that people do and don't say afterwards that I think can influence the health of their relationship. And in that first study, I also looked at this idea of regret, that for people who aren't in committed relationships, saying I love you to a partner of 2 weeks that you've just been hooking up with because you have this surge of hormones that's making you feel so connected and warm and fuzzy can actually be a really bad thing. And what I found in that first study is that people who were in casual or open relationships regretted their communication during pillow talk significantly more than those who were in committed relationships.
Very, very interesting stuff. And, I think about it from the media perspective. We keep talking about our different backgrounds and whatnot. The media socialization of adolescents, and particularly adolescent males, is so much driven towards getting sex. And it ties in with the pickup artist thing that we were talking about. This idea that we can somehow do the right thing and the right combination of steps interpersonally, romantically, etc., socially, and we will end up having sex as if it's some holy grail of social existence. And so it sets up an expectation where what comes next is almost irrelevant.
Right. And there's so much focus on that buildup. Like, how do you get to the sexual encounter? What leads to the sexual encounter? But really, I think what's happening after is where that intimacy and that closeness, and as an interpersonal researcher, where the relationship building can really happen. It's that time after where people feel a lot of times most connected to their partner. But I agree, it's all sort of connected from that media perspective of it just ends with sex. And on TV, we don't see a lot about pillow talk either. It sort of just ends with the couple going into the bedroom or hooking up and doesn't really talk about what happens after that can have a strong effect on the relationship.
And usually in narratives where there's pillow talk, it's utilitarian. It moves the plot forward because they'll start talking about work the next day or, are we going to go on that trip or something? And it's not, and granted, that may be part of normal pillow talk, absolutely, but it leaves out all the things that you're describing.
Right. It leaves out that relationship formation part. And definitely in more established relationships, I've had people say, is this research going to apply to married couples who probably do use it in a more utilitarian way, where they are being practical and doing planning, or if they have kids, talking about, what they need to do the next day to get up, things like that. But I think in new relationships is where pillow talk is most influential, when people are developing that relationship and starting to build that closeness, that this can move you along that trajectory.
You've mentioned something in your research in the past that I grasped onto with that, though, that even in those more senior relationships where people have been together for a while and the relationship is established, it can serve a maintenance role. And we talk about how important maintenance is, of course, in all relationships. If it's a facilitator of disclosure, even if the disclosure isn't necessarily intimate, but permits them to progress in terms of some degree of relational maintenance, that's important too.
Right. And that's a great point. And it's something that I want to look at in future research as I move beyond looking at college students or younger people and their relationships, is this idea that even for people who have been together for 10, 20, 30 years, that those moments after might sort of be that time where they keep that intimacy going, where they keep it alive. And, you hear about so many relationships and marriages being sexless marriages. I forget what the exact statistic is, but it's pretty high. And maybe part of that is because people aren't seeing it as a time of connection. It's more just something that has to get done or a chore. Right. And that pillow talk can help make it a more intimate time, make it this moment that the couple has together outside of all the other stresses of life and taking care of a home and raising a family. And so, yeah, it could be really important for maintaining a relationship and having those sort of special shared moments.
Interesting. So I see a parallel here. Last week we talked to Dr. Ross Buck, and he talked a lot about emotional education and the different feelings associated with various even risky behaviors. Well, in this case, especially in new formations, it may be a very risky behavior, but perhaps in this case it's more of a positive. Those are often framed in terms of interventions that maybe educating people about the emotions they'll feel if they can have a positive reaction, a positive conversation, that maybe that would be beneficial to motivating people to get over that. It's just a chore. It's just something we do in more senior relationships.
Right, definitely. I think it would be great, if my future research shows that this does have a positive effect on relationships and relational health, to then use that as a way to intervene in relationships and say, increasing your sexual activity and your pillow talk after can actually help bring you closer. And focusing on the emotions that can come from that, using that as a special time. And so that's sort of where my next step is going, is looking at what are the effects of pillow talk on relationship satisfaction over a certain amount of time. So not just looking at what predicts how people communicate after sexual activity, but how might that pillow talk then help or hurt the relationship down the road.
Well, this line of research, and especially the fact that you're pretty much the only one really doing a lot of it, is just replete with opportunity. So I think you're going to go quite far with it.
Yeah, there's almost too much to study. I'm glad to hear that there's a lot of younger people in graduate school and new scholars who are interested in doing this research, because there's so many questions. And there's a few people here and there. I know there's some evolutionary psychologists who are looking at what they call the postcoital time interval. So they look at, from a very evolutionary perspective, what people do after. So things like snacking, sleeping, talking, cuddling, but not quite the communication component in as much detail. And there's one other scholar who has looked at how what you do after sexual activity relates to relationship satisfaction, but it was less looking at the content and the dimensions of people's communication and just looking at how long they were talking after, how long they were snuggling after. So there is some research popping up. Of course, I wish there was more, and hopefully there will be more in the future.
Well, certainly. And what I really like is that you've done a really good job with this research of keeping it accessible, so that when you explain it, it's graspable, it's understandable, it's relevant, but you merge communication and science quite well, and you talk about both in concert with one another. And a lot of people, a lot of researchers, and a lot of scholars kind of shy away from that. And for our students in COM 1000, it's important to emphasize that there are scientific bases and roots to a lot of the work that we do. So could you talk maybe for a minute about how you came to realize that there was a connection between the biology of it and the actual communication theory of it?
Yeah, definitely. I'm really excited to see that the field, especially interpersonal communication, is moving towards considering the biological components that maybe are connected to some of our communication processes. So the communibiological paradigm has been around for a while, but I think people shied away from this idea that we are predisposed to certain communication patterns because originally it sounded a little bit biologically deterministic. I think some people read that as you're born a certain way and your biology dictates how you communicate, and if you were born shy or born unable to communicate well, there's nothing you can do. Right. And really I'd say the new wave of research looking at communication and biology has just reinforced that this is another piece of the puzzle of understanding why people communicate the way they do. And so I think people have taken to that idea much more. Like, there's different components. Some is personality, some is predisposition, some could be genes or hormones, and have started to mix that into understanding why we communicate the way we do. And so I started studying the biology behind communication with my advisor, Tammy Afifi, as I mentioned before. When I was in graduate school, she did a study where we were looking at how communication between parents and children influenced children's physiological stress responses. So basically what we did is we had parents and children come to the lab. And when I say children, we were mostly looking at teenagers, college students. They weren't really children, right. Young adults, I should say. So we had them talk to their parent about something stressful in the parent's relationship. And so they were with one parent. So let's say you came to the lab with your mom, and your mom's telling you maybe some of the issues she's having with dad. Some of it was serious, depending on what's going on in that relationship. Some of it was mundane, like, well, we can't decide what to put in the garden. But then we looked at how stressed out does the child get based on what the parent's disclosing. Mm-hmm. And what we saw is that children were having these physiological stress responses. So we looked at things like cortisol, which is the stress hormone, and salivary alpha amylase, which is, we think, an indicator of anxiety. And we saw that children were getting more physiologically upset as parents were disclosing things that were less appropriate. Mm-hmm. And so that study really got me interested in the ways that our bodies respond to communication. But then as I moved towards the Pillow Talk study, I became interested in sort of the opposite. How does our biology and our genes influence how we communicate? Mm-hmm. So the other study was how does communication influence biology? And now I was moving towards how does biology influence communication? Mm-hmm. And that's where I started looking at things like oxytocin and some other research. I looked at people's genes and their DNA and just kind of finding some of the links there that might interact with other personality factors and communication tendencies to predict people's communication.
And you do a good job laying out kind of the way the paradigm operates and how it can be looked at in multiple ways. And in fact, you've looked at it in both fashions, how it's an effect and then it's affected by kind of a perspective.
Right.
So it's definitely there, and it's really interesting to see. And for many, and it's particularly a lot of times, if you're not familiar with the field of communication, you don't think that's really connected to what it is we're doing.
Yeah, people are always confused when I tell them that I collect saliva samples. They're like, but you're a communication scholar. Why would you be doing that? But yeah, I think it's an exciting time for this type of research because other fields like psychology have been doing this for a while, but even though communication, there are definitely some scholars who have been doing it for a long time and laid that groundwork, I feel like in the past decade, it's just taken off. And now a lot of people are integrating those physio measures, and there's so many more resources out there for social scientists who want to add that component. And so, as we begin to integrate that in more, I think people are understanding how these different areas of research can really come together and paint a fuller picture of communication processes.
It's just that so few of us own lab coats. That's really what it is. If we walked around in white lab coats, perhaps it would be more indicative of the things that we're measuring or collecting or analyzing.
Definitely. We would look really fancy. We could take whatever samples we wanted. It'd be great.
All right. So obviously you've done a lot of research in terms of sex and the communication of sex and being a sex researcher, so to speak. There's a lot of challenges that are presented with this. This is not a topic that comes easily. I think you and I are doing a good job talking about it here, but by and large, if we're all out chatting and this comes up, I think people are fascinated by it, but they might be hesitant into how to engage it. So the whole research process is a little bit different for you, and you've talked about that before. You've written about it before.
Yeah, it's interesting researching this topic. I was definitely apprehensive at first, and I know when I was in graduate school, I was warned that researching something that makes some people uncomfortable could hurt my job prospects, but I just knew this is what I wanted to study, and I felt like it was important to study this. And so I forged on, and luckily the response has been mostly positive. I definitely have had several experiences where I'm giving a presentation and I say the word orgasm and there's nervous chuckles in the back of the room. But I've liked to believe that in the past several years since I've been talking about this more, I see it less and less. I think the more people who are talking about sex, the less taboo it is, which I think most people who study this would say is good. We need to be able to have honest conversations and do sex-positive research, not just STD prevention research. We need to talk about how people can have satisfying sexual relationships. And so I think being able to talk about it is a first step, but definitely some people don't want to talk about it or are uncomfortable. It kind of goes one direction or the other. Either people shut down and don't want to mention it, or they want to tell you every detail about their sex life and ask you questions. So that's a different type of challenge, is all the stories you hear. But to me, what that really signifies is that so many people don't have a safe space for talking about sexual issues. Right. And so when they meet someone who they feel they can talk to about this, sometimes they want to unload. Here they found this person who they don't have to feel uncomfortable with. And so I think that just kind of emphasizes that we need to talk about it more.
Right.
So yeah, but it can be challenging at times.
And I think one of the other things that was interesting was a lot of people have given you feedback before that how are you permitted to collect this data? We have the Institutional Review Board, we call them the IRB, and they approve our research studies. How do you get this stuff by IRB was something that you've mentioned in the past as an issue.
Yeah. So I'm actually just starting my first Pillow Talk study here at UConn. So that's under review right now with IRB. So we'll see how it goes here. But definitely with previous IRBs I've worked with, they were very open and accepting of this topic. I think what they really wanted was just that all participants would know what they were getting into.
Right.
And so I've always been really, really clear in my consent forms and when I was recruiting participants that this is a study about how you talk to your partners after sex. And I'm going to ask you questions about your sex life. And if that makes you uncomfortable, then this is not the study for you. And so I think just letting people know up front what they're getting into definitely helps the IRB be okay with the studies. Transparency, making sure participants aren't surprised or uncomfortable is key. And like I said, I feel like there are surprisingly so many people who want a space to talk and think about sexual experience that I've never had trouble recruiting participants. People have said it's been a good experience for them to reflect upon these things. So I think, once the IRB realizes that I'm not going to make anyone do anything uncomfortable or that they can drop out if they are uncomfortable, then they're usually fine with things.
Right. And I think that's the important point, and something that I'm glad you mentioned, that it's not necessarily the topic of the research study, but the way in which the topic is approached and what kind of harm that approach might make to participants that really seems to me to be of the chief concern in those sorts of situations.
Right. And it's about being respectful even in just how you word questions to people's different sensitivities. I realize that not everyone will be as open about talking about these issues as I am. And so I always try to approach things delicately, even just the way I word my surveys or how I present my research to others so that they don't feel offended just reading a question.
Right. Has anybody ever made you uncomfortable in terms of their reaction to your studies or what you study?
No. Maybe I'm just blocking things out. Nothing comes to mind. Did I mention something in a study that you're thinking of?
No. Nothing in particular. It's a curiosity of mine that, because sometimes when you present something that's a little left of center or right of center for that matter, people will get a very visceral reaction to it. And every now and then you'll see something at a conference or whatnot where a scholar reacts. Have you ever had any of those situations?
I think the one presentation I referenced before where there was the person chuckling when I said orgasm, that made me a little bit upset just because it's a key variable in my research. So then I had a long talk with friends afterwards about should I use the word orgasm or should I use the word sexual climax? And we had a big debate about which word was appropriate. And now in hindsight, I'm I'm going to use the word that I want to use. And orgasm is the word in literature. It's scientific. If it makes people uncomfortable, well, I'm sorry. We're adults here and we're talking about research. And so I think when I was in graduate school, I was a little bit more insecure about some of the terminology. And definitely some of those initial reactions to my research shaped that. But now, as I continue to do this research, I'm more confident in using the language. And it's fun. At NCA this past year, several people came up and they were like, you're the reason my class talks about orgasms. And I was like, well, I don't know if that's the reputation I was hoping to have in the field, but I'm glad that it's making more people comfortable discussing this because I know several people use it in grad classes at the Pillow Talk study, and then they use that language too, and they're comfortable with it. And so I think as this research gets disseminated and more people do this type of research, less people have to go through what I went through with the chuckling or the awkwardness.
Right.
And it'll be more normal.
Certainly. And, if anything, it speaks to the situation that we are uncomfortable talking about sex. And so there are a lot of things that we kind of ignore, block out, or don't acknowledge. And even from a research perspective that we haven't. And that's opened the door for you to do the work that you're doing.
Right. Exactly. And that's why there still is so much to do because people have been doing sex research for a very long time. So I don't want to say I'm the only one doing this. I'm definitely not. But I think more and more people are talking about it, especially in communication, and not just taking their research that's sex-related and bringing it only to sexuality conferences. So I think bringing it into people's academic homes is helpful in expanding that.
Right, and it's a great service, frankly, because when you talk so much about relationship formation and development and dissolution, and you leave out sex,
right,
when it's such a key part of those things. In several relationships, it's obviously important. So my next question then is, where does this research need to head next?
Where does it need to head next? I think the next big step, at least for me, is to do an experiment to actually see whether people's pillow talk and increasing their pillow talk does help the relationship. Right now, everything I've done has been survey data and correlational in nature, and it would be nice to kind of go towards that intervention route that you mentioned before and see, does focusing and increasing pillow talk in a relationship and being more mindful of the pillow talk actually make couples healthier and happier. So that's the next big step for me with this research, and looking at how pillow talk influences everyday talk. So for example, if you're having more pillow talk in your relationship, which ideally is increasing your intimacy and closeness with your partner, are you better able to handle other stressors than when you have to deal with conflict or something bad happens or you have a stressful event? Has all this pillow talk and this intimacy helped to build a really secure base so that you're better able to deal with that as a couple? So that's sort of the next big step that I see things going.
And it sounds like a great direction to take things, and it sounds like it'll be really interesting, just like the work that's come before it.
I hope so. I'm excited to get going on the next study.
So my last research-related question, it may not be so much research as pedagogy, but you're also a scholar who teaches gender and communication, and obviously our conversation today has been mainly about sex talk and pillow talk, but related to all of that, and maybe especially on this gender thing, is there anything interesting you can tell our audience, anything that jumps out to you that maybe a quick hit for students who haven't heard from the gender realm in terms of communication research or studies?
So gendered related to pillow talk or separate from pillow talk?
It really depends on what you prefer to talk about.
I go back and forth between thinking that sex and gender are both very important to communication research and thinking that they're completely overemphasized as well. In my class, we talk a lot about how sex doesn't really account for as much variation in people's communication as they think. So this idea that men are from Mars and women are from Venus, I think is pretty inaccurate. I don't think men and women are so different that we can't see eye to eye. I think that there's a lot of socialization and media processes that influence why people communicate that way. So I constantly struggle with how to look at sex and gender in my own research because I do want to acknowledge that men and women are often gendered and socialized in different ways, but I also don't want to assume that just because I'm a woman and you're a man, we're going to speak completely differently.
Right.
And so I've tried to start to look at that with the pillow talk research, and I have found some differences between men and women in some studies, and others that's not there. So my gut instinct from what I've seen so far is that men and women aren't that different during their pillow talk, and I think we know that women are generally socialized to be more focused on relationships. And so maybe some of that comes out during pillow talk, that they are a little more relational, but it's such an intimate time that I think that sort of evens the playing field, that, men are also going to engage in that relational talk during this time as well. I don't know if that answered your question.
I think it does. No, and I think that you make a good point with the intimacy of that moment. I mean, for various reasons related to sex, the fact that sex has just occurred, the condition both people are in terms of they're usually in a vulnerable position, usually alone, laying in a situation. I mean, that really does open the door for intimacy and perhaps does remove some of those societal expectations about how we're supposed to communicate or what we're supposed to talk about.
Definitely. So I always try to be mindful of those different socialized gender norms, but then also not assume that they're going to exist in every context, that there might be other factors that outweigh that.
All right. Okay. So we tend to wrap up our interviews with a couple of questions. I ask everybody the same questions. They're kind of fun. I keep thinking about what I would say if someone asked me, but I'll ask you the first one. So if you were to come into COM 1000 and you get one lecture, 50 minutes long, what would you lecture on? Anything in the communication realm?
I would have to talk about pillow talk. I would just, or maybe just sex and communication broadly from more of a sex positive perspective. I definitely do that in my interpersonal class. We have a chapter where we talk about communication, about sex, around sex. And yeah, I think it's just good to talk about sex in a way that doesn't focus on how people negotiate condom use or talk about STDs, which is all really, really important research, and there's great research out there. But it gives this like sex negative perspective, right? That sex is a scary thing and bad things can happen. There can be negative outcomes. So if I had 50 minutes, I'd probably use it to promote this type of research, talk about some of the other research people in the field and outside the field are doing to get that idea going, that we can talk about sexual satisfaction. We can talk with partners about how to improve sexual relationships, because it's so simple, but there's so much research showing that talking about sexual preferences increases sexual satisfaction, but so many people are scared to talk about that. And so that's what I'd probably spend my 50 minutes talking about.
And I think it would be a fascinating lecture. I think it would go over really well. I think the students would absolutely really enjoy everything there is to say about it. Second question, final question,
Okay.
A little bit different. So I'm looking at this from a different perspective, but so you've gone through your life, you've studied communication, you started with a little bit of media and journalism, you've moved into interpersonal, and now heavy into interpersonal, you've touched upon communicobiological, you've done all this different research, you've studied taboo subjects, you've gone places, seen things, you've lived on the East Coast and the West Coast, you are a communication expert in several different ways of looking at it. What would you say to our communication students who are just starting their academic career, some of which may be here for 4 years, some may go far and beyond, and some may be sitting across from me in a podcast one day? what piece of advice related to communication would you give them? So maybe not academic, maybe academic, but what one piece of advice from your experience would you give about their communication?
Okay, I think my one piece of advice would be to tell people what you think and what you feel, which I guess sounds really simple, but the more I talk to people, the more I realize how much we keep bottled up. And I think, especially as an interpersonal person, focus on relationships, that so much can be solved by just telling someone what makes you happy, what makes you sad, what upset you, and not just bottling that all up and keeping that inside. And so I think that, that applies not even just in relationships, but in lots of different realms, saying what you think and feel and just being open and not being scared to express those feelings and keep them inside. And I think that's something that, Dr. Buck echoed last week about emotional expression, that we're often taught to keep things inside, especially men are socialized to behave that way. And I think that can have really detrimental effects. If we could just say what we think and, as receivers of that message, be more open and understanding with people as they're trying to work through feelings or things that they're going through, I think we'd all be a little bit better.
I think that is a wonderful piece of advice, because so many times, especially even in this field, we talk so much about all the caveats to communication, but be sure to do it like this and be aware of this and don't think about that, but you have to consider this, that we sometimes lose that ability to just express ourselves. But what we see, by and large, across all the research is that expression tends to be the easiest message to receive, and then thus we can react to it.
Right, exactly. And we are taught so much to monitor what we're saying, to be careful about what you say or how you express it, that I think sometimes we start to then just keep things inside, which is not necessarily a good thing.
No, and then we can get into how it generates stress and cortisol
right.
and all that, and we
come
go
full
all
circle.
the way back around. Okay, so a wonderful conversation about a questionable topic that's not really that questionable. It's actually very interesting and very worth discussing, and I think people, frankly, all of them should discuss it more and be more aware of it. Dr. Amanda Dennis does research in sex communication. She's our guest today. Thank you so much for sitting down with us.
This was so fun.
All right, take care, Amanda.
You too.
All right, a wonderful, fascinating, and provocative conversation with Amanda Dennis today. Really intriguing topic, pillow talk, and the ways in which we behave after private moments and after things like sex and after climax. All topics that perhaps we're uncomfortable discussing at times, but that really do shed a light on some of the more intimate forms of communication and the role of communication in something that we often treat as its own event in sex. So really fascinating information today. I'd like to thank Dr. Amanda Dennis again for partaking, and hopefully you can think about some of these things as you form your relationships and perhaps even as you engage in intimate moments with those in your lives. So sex matters. We knew that already, but we do know that the communication around sex matters even more than we perhaps think. Thank you very much for listening to episode number 5 of Compendium. We'll be back in a couple of weeks after spring break with our next topic. We'll see you then. Take care. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the host and his guests. They do not reflect the views of the University of Connecticut, the UConn Department of Communication, or the COM 1000 course itself.